Hello, everyone, and welcome back to yet another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you guys yet again for tuning in to today's show. We have a good slate of segments ahead for you today. We start off doing a deep dive into ESPN's Fantasy Top 25, looking at some of the big names on that list. Then I will offer you up some draft strategies and tips for your upcoming fantasy football drafts. Then I will evaluate one of the more controversial, if you will, QB rooms in terms of fantasy purposes. And then, of course, I close out today's show with two fascinating IDP player profiles about two up-and-coming secondary players. But before we get into any of those exciting segments, I do want to remind you to like, follow, and subscribe to the show. It's a huge support to everyone involved at the network. We also receive a ton of tips and donations, so if you do feel so inclined, please consider leaving them at the link. GSMC.cloud is another way to support both me, my fellow podcasters, and ultimately the network at large. You can also leave any questions, comments, or concerns about the show and prior segments, or even today's show, and they will be answered and addressed at the beginning of the next episode. But without further ado, let's jump right into a very exciting episode. Let's start off in the realm of top 25s. That is, ESPN releasing their fantasy football players' top 25 of the 21st century. Fantasy football, its nascent stages kind of started in the early 2000s. I know that there were a ton of different ways that you could play growing up in, say, the 90s, even the 80s, but it was all generated, the kind of hype surrounding it generated in the early 2000s. And to start the 21st century, there were some fantastic fantasy football players, and we're going to be looking at some of these on those lists that really stand out to me, really defined what fantasy football is all about, and maybe led to this kind of prelude to what we're seeing in fantasy football right now, because as you can see from what I'm going to talk about on this list, there are a lot of different positions. There are a lot of diverse guys at different positions who deserve to be on this list. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. And I'm really shocked at the number one overall fantasy football player that they named at the top of their list, because it's not the guy that everyone's been thinking about. In fact, it's a running back who never made a Super Bowl, who was on a team that never really challenged for the playoffs even, but he's still one of the greatest running backs of the early 2000s and of all time. And that is LaDainian Tomlinson. He had fantastic numbers for the running back position, but no other season was so fascinating for LaDainian Tomlinson than 2006, when he had 481.1 PPR points and 31 total touchdowns. He had 443.84 in 2005. Two of the best single-season PPR totals. He was a PPR monster starting off his career with LA. Fantastic throughout. Fantastic rusher. Fantastic receiver. Position high. 3,451.32 PPR fantasy points in the decade. I don't think that's a record that's going to be topped. Maybe Christian McCaffrey could touch it in the next couple of years, but LaDainian Tomlinson truly stands the test of time. And looking at the running back market now has really kind of bolstered what the running back market could become. He's redefined it. He's retooled it. He's really set the bar for what is expected, really, out of running backs at the running back position in fantasy terms. And then, of course, if you want to talk about positional fits, being a receiving running back really does help you a lot. And so, kudos to LaDainian Tomlinson for beating out this number 2 guy who everyone thought would have been at the top in Tom Brady, fantasy career leader, 5,944.36 fantasy points, 755.4 points ahead of other quarterbacks, more than any non-quarterbacks, 1,500. Second best fantasy season of all time came at the age of 44. That is his best fantasy football season of all time. Speaks to his longevity in this league. Speaks to the greatness that Tom Brady, whether you like him or not, brought to the game of football at the quarterback position. And at 44 years old, 374.74 fantasy points. And what I really think defines Tom Brady is not just his greatness, but the way he did it. The way he steadily and consistently improved year after year, where most quarterbacks would have probably retired around the 35 to 40 mark. He played well into his 40s and still believes he actually has something left in the tank. He wouldn't mind playing again, and he would gladly take up any offers that come his way should a team want to take a flyer on him. But for now, let's just appreciate the fact that Tom Brady, in real life and in fantasy, made the game of football great. And now let's switch to the wide receiver position, where the market's really in flux right now. But if you look at the early 2000s, you really had some really great options. And at number 6, Randy Moss might have been the best of all. While two of his best seasons in the league don't count because obviously they came in the late 90s, 98 and 99. 07, 23 receiving touchdowns for him, 385.3 fantasy points, second most ever at the position. No matter whether he played for Minnesota, New England, man was always catching passes. Really incredible when it comes to his catch radius. And even though they don't necessarily list any of the PPR stats for him, they're probably very high. And when I look at the receivers of this age, there definitely are some that really pop off the page and really jump out at you when you're picking in terms of fantasy. But no one really has the aura and presence of a Randy Moss. No one really grabs my attention like a Randy Moss right now. Yes, Justin Jefferson has a very similar catch radius. Yes, there are some stars waiting in the wings. There's no one who really could grab a position by the scruff of the neck and make it their own. And that's what Randy Moss did in the early parts of the century. And then, to round it all off, let's go to the tight end position. Because that position right now is perhaps the most scrutinized in fantasy. Nobody thought the tight end position would be where it is right now, where we have two disparate generations. The elder guard and Travis Kelce, George Kittle, and Mark Andrews. The younger guard, Sam Laporta, Trey McBride. We never thought we would be here talking about these guys. And the guy in number 9 on ESPN's list might have just led the revolution. Might have just started the revolution at the tight end position in terms of fantasy. When I think about tight ends of the past 2 decades, this guy should top the list. Never really made deep playoff runs. Never really got the attention he deserved until now. And now, I can safely say that if it weren't for this guy, I don't really think the tight end position in fantasy would be where it is. And thank God for him, is Tony Gonzalez. Tony Gonzalez, when you think about tight ends in the modern era especially, he's really someone who ticks all the boxes for the tight end position. If you go back in history, yes, you have like Kellen Winslow at the tight end position, maybe a Mike Ditka or something like that. But in fantasy purposes, in fantasy terms, you can't get better than Tony Gonzalez. He had 70 catches in 13 of the 14 years he played. That's impressive for a tight end position. He averaged over 200 plus points at the tight end position, where it's very rare we ever see tight ends really get over 200 points 10 times this century. He truly is a figurehead for the tight end movement. And I look at what's happening today. Guys like Travis Kelce and George Kittle and Mark Andrews being the pinnacles of longevity at the tight end position, being the pinnacles of what people want in a fantasy tight end. It's all because of Tony Gonzalez. And I really hope these younger tight ends take Tony Gonzalez's practices to heart and really model their game after his. because I really think the tight end position not only is growing more important in how you view the certain players within that spectrum, but also how they develop consistently as players. We want this younger generation to be at the levels where Travis Kelce, Mark Andrews, and George Kittle are right now. And so they have to find a way to continue to progress in order for that narrative to play along. But ultimately, when I look at the players I've named on this list, I tried to name one from every position to show you how far fantasy football has come and how far we have come in terms of our views in terms of selecting our fantasy football teams. And so I really hope that this segment gives you a nice little perspective on how you should build your fantasy team going forward. Because there aren't going to be guys like this anymore. That's the fact of the matter. The 21st century was perhaps the height, and I'm sad to say it, the height of fantasy football. And yes, you have fantastic players now, but are they really generation defining as a LaDainian Tomlinson, as a Tom Brady, as a Randy Moss, as a Tony Gonzalez? You're going to have to rethink about that question as these next couple of years go on. Because these guys are excellent, but me sitting here saying these names cements them into a history of players you'll rarely find in fantasy. And it's ultimately up to us how to define fantasy going forward. Because it's not just the player, it's the lore they create. It's the narrative they set at the position that makes them stand the test of time. And that's the ultimate goal for what our generation of fantasy football players and managers should aim for. Because in 25 years or so, when they come up with another top 25 list, there are going to be some names that are controversial. None of these names are controversial here today. But that will just about do it for this segment of today's show. Coming up next, we transfer and kind of stay in the fantasy football realm to draft strategies. How to select your fantasy football team. Kind of a interesting duality between fantasy football of the past and fantasy football of the present. We'll be right back after the break with that.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?